Republicans setting the stage at last night's RNC warned of a dystopian American future should Joe Biden win the White House. The first night's speakers were effusive in their praise of President Trump, but offered few policy specifics. President Trump had promised this week's Republican National Convention would feature a rosier outlook for the U.S. His party criticized Democrats for what they called a bleak assessment of the country during their virtual gathering. Instead, the Republican convention's opening night emphasized fear of a future under his Democratic opponent. Here's the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., last night.
Joe Biden and the radical left are now coming for our freedom of speech. They want to bully us into submission. If they get their way, it will no longer be the silent majority. It will be the silenced majority. This has to stop.
Other speakers emphasized a different outlook, seeking to assure viewers Republicans provide the best hope for the country. That included Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina and former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley.
Joe Biden and the Democrats are still blaming America first. Donald Trump has always put America first, and he has earned 4 more years as president.
Our family went from cotton to Congress in one lifetime. And that's why I believe the next American century can be better than the last. There are millions of families just like mine all across this nation, full of potential, seeking to live the American dream. And I'm here tonight to tell you that supporting the Republican ticket gives you the best chance of making that dream a reality.
On the issues, Republicans focused heavily on so-called cancel culture, socialism, and gun rights. There was very little mention of the coronavirus pandemic or double-digit unemployment. In a brief appearance with essential workers yesterday, the president again downplayed the pandemic and praised his own response.
Well, I'm for the nurses, I'm for the doctors, I'm for everybody. We just have to make this China virus go away, and it's happening.
But as of today, more than 177,000 people in the U.S. have died from the virus. Tens of thousands of new cases are reported each day. Meanwhile, tonight's theme for the RNC focuses on America as a, quote, land of opportunity. First Lady Melania Trump will headline the event. Other speakers include Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, and 2 of the president's children, Eric and Tiffany. For more, let's bring in Paula Reid, Nikole Killion, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Anita Kumar. Paula is a CBS News White House correspondent. Nikole is a CBS News correspondent in Washington. Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter, and Anita is a White House correspondent and associate editor for Politico. Welcome to you all. Paula, I want to start with you. The president had insisted Republicans would emphasize a positive vision for the country. Did that happen?
Elaine, I was surprised to hear the White House and the campaign insisting that this convention was going to be positive and upbeat, because on the campaign trail, the president's message has been pretty dark. He's been conjuring up images of smoldering Democratic-led cities, blood-stained sidewalks. And that's why last night, even though we were promised that this would be a convention that would lay out the Republican Party's values and their goals, it was mostly laying out the threat posed by the Democratic Party and how President Trump is the only one who can protect Americans. Now, tonight, of course, all eyes will be on First Lady Melania Trump, and her spokeswoman was asked earlier today if her speech will also be sort of dark. But her spokeswoman, Stephanie Grisham, insisted that the First Lady is not typically ominous and that she will be positive and uplifting. But, of course, her speech will be overshadowed by the fact that in 2016, there were allegations of plagiarism about her speech. But we're told that she will put forth a message trying to convince voters why her husband deserves another term, and it'll be interesting to see if that's sort of framed as a positive, as a promise, or as a threat.
Yeah, so looking forward to that. Nikole, did we hear much of the traditional message from Republicans when it comes to issues like social conservatism, lower taxes, a strong foreign policy?
Well, I think you heard a mix. And, to Paula's point, while some of the messaging was focused more on, we must save our country and this is why you must elect Donald Trump. On the other hand, when you listen to somebody like a Senator Tim Scott, who really told a very personal narrative last night, you got some of that significance of conservatism and family values, highlighted in his speech. With that soundbite you played, going from cotton to Congress in a lifetime, that soundbite has been playing, constantly on a continuum. So, I mean, on the one hand, you did have speakers like that kind of highlighting the value of the American dream, highlighting family values, and Nikki Haley's speech, too, where she talked about the president's policies when it comes to foreign policy, that he's been tough on North Korea and, got out of the Iran nuclear deal and, moved the embassy to Jerusalem, really presenting this hawkish vision of foreign policy. In some of those speeches, yes, you did hear some of that traditional Republican messaging, but again, also this very stark contrast of, again, painting the Democrats as these radical left socialists that, will ruin our country if Joe Biden gets into office. So, I would say it was a tale of two messages last night.
Yeah, very much so. Caitlin, as you well know, the Republicans criticized the Democratic convention for being short on policy specifics. I wonder, did you hear much on what Republicans and the president are specifically offering the American people?
Well, hearing from Republicans, you might have forgotten that there is a pandemic going on. They were trying to message to voters and their base voters as well that, kind of saying, remember how everything was before the pandemic hit. You heard Nikki Haley describing this as a virus given to us by communist China, so placing the blame there. And the focus was on how the economy was before the pandemic hit. And that's because when you look at polling, while most voters disapprove of how Trump is handling the coronavirus, they do give him good grades on the economy. So that could be a silver lining for Republicans. And Democrats watching the speeches last night were commenting that it's an alternate reality. Well, it's important to kind of take a step back and look at where the Republican Party is right now. When you look at our polling released Sunday, you do find an alternate reality from the one that Democrats have been describing. Republicans are largely united around Donald Trump. Republicans do not believe that the number of deaths reported because of coronavirus is accurate. They also believe that the direction of the economy is good, and they also believe that the president's handling of coronavirus is good and think they're better off than they were 4 years ago. So you saw this very direct appeal to the Republican base of the party, and I think it's interesting to see the contrasts presented by Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, certainly compelling stories. I also think that by speaking at that convention last night, both of them acknowledged that the future of the Republican Party is going to be intertwined with Donald Trump and his base of support. Otherwise, they would not be speaking at such a venue. So I think it tells us a lot about where the Republican Party is and how closely defined it is by Trump.
Yeah. So, Anita, with that in mind, as Caitlin just laid out, this appeal to the president's base, did you also see some attempts last night to expand that core support? And also, is there a way of doing that while still sort of keeping within President Trump's brand?
Well, it's a great question. I felt like last night was two different things, right? There was the direct appeal to the base. And as we've just talked about, there were so many issues where they were talking about law and order and gun rights, all those things that we, that we have come to expect from President Trump, who often speaks directly to his base and really not much else. But it was clear that they were also trying to appeal to others. There were several African Americans who spoke. There was a Democrat who spoke that said he was supporting President Trump. You had Nikki Haley speak in a much different way. So it is clear that they are trying to expand that, but it was both of those things together. So if you're watching the whole thing, it felt a little bit disjointed. Which are they trying to do? Was there one particular message? And I would have to say probably not. So they're trying to do both of those things at the same time. And the question is, will that work? Can you really appeal to others when you're still talking about this gloomy, dark, chaos that's going to come if Joe Biden is elected? And that's really been a problem for them. While the Trump campaign has really tried to expand expand the map, expand to other groups, African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans. President Trump really always doubles down on his base.
Yeah, we've seen that time and time again. Absolutely, Anita. Well, Paula, absent for much of the night was a major discussion of the coronavirus pandemic. The president is touting the FDA's emergency order to use convalescent plasma to treat COVID-19 patients. Paula, what are we hearing from scientists and the FDA's own commissioner, Stephen Hahn?
Well, Elaine, the campaign does not want this election to be a referendum on President Trump's handling of coronavirus. So anytime it is mentioned, usually what you hear about is the marshaling, the unprecedented marshaling of the private sector and the government's response. Now, just the day before the RNC kicked off, the president had a press conference here at the White House to announce what he described as a historic breakthrough in the fight against coronavirus related to a blood plasma therapy. Now, alongside him was the FDA Commissioner, Stephen Hahn. He endorsed this treatment. And even though the research is inconclusive about how much it can really help someone with COVID, and most other top health officials describe this not as historic, but as incremental. Now, immediately, Dr. Hahn was hit with some pretty fierce criticism, allegations that he was a Trump sycophant and not actually acting as an objective federal health official. Now, this morning on CBS This Morning, he backed off of his endorsement of this treatment. He said, in fact, that the criticism that he faced was entirely justified, and that what he should have said is that the data shows a relative risk reduction, not an absolute one. But, Elaine, this raises more concerns. There are a lot of concerns that the president and other members of his administration may try to rush therapies or rush a vaccine to help the president get reelected in November. And that may put people off. Even if there is a legitimate vaccine or a legitimate therapy, there are some concerns about whether politics have interfered with the science here.
Right. That's something that we've seen in polling on this topic. Nikole, I want to turn to another issue. There were some contradictory attacks laid out by the speakers when going after Joe Biden, for instance, on the issue of the prison system. Let's play comments first from Representative Matt Gaetz, then from Georgia State House member Vernon Jones.
They'll disarm you, empty the prisons, lock you in your home, and invite MS-13 to live next door. And the police aren't coming when you call. In Democrat-run cities, they're already being defunded, disbanded.
He delivered historic criminal justice reform. He ended once and for all the policy of incarceration of black people, which has decimated our communities, caused by no other than Joe Biden.
So you have one line of attack warning that Joe Biden will let criminals out of jail, the other that President Trump has fought against mass incarceration. Nikole, how does this illustrate the president's messaging?
Well, I think on a couple of fronts, and it really follows a line that we have heard from the campaign, really from the start here. If you expand beyond what those two speakers said, also in their remarks, they painted Joe Biden as this basement dweller, which is something that the Trump campaign, talks about every single day. And also, I think specifically when you look at Matt Gaetz in particular, he really took some very pointed digs at the Democrats and more specifically at Joe Biden, suggesting this would be like a weekend at Bernie's if Joe Biden were to be elected in a horror film. So really kind of taking it to another level as far as that argument is concerned. As far as Vernon Jones, who is a Democrat in the Georgia legislature, his argument more specifically was directed towards African American voters. And this is something, too, that we have heard the Trump campaign really try to make a play for, as saying, look, African Americans don't vote in a monolith. The Democratic Party has taken black voters for granted. And so here's why you need to maybe think about voting for the president. And so he ticked off all of these things, whether it's the work that the president has done with regard to opportunity zones, or as far as criminal justice reform is concerned, or as far as, other policies, for instance, on police reform, that those are all, or funding for HBCUs, those are all things that have been supportive of the African American community. Now, that is certainly debatable, but that certainly is the argument that the Trump campaign has put forward. And certainly we know that the Biden campaign is making a very strong push for African American voters as well, particularly African African-American males. That is certainly, I think, a demographic that both campaigns are targeting, simply because last cycle we saw more African-American males voting for President Trump relative to African-American women. And so, while African-American women tended to support Hillary Clinton more so last cycle, that was not the case with black men. So we're really seeing, both campaigns try to make a play there. And so that was part of that messaging that you heard from, in particular, from Representative Jones last night.
And Caitlin, on that note, we heard other speakers touch on this issue of race. Here's what Nikki Haley had to say.
There's one more important area where our president is right. He knows that political correctness and cancel culture are dangerous and just plain wrong. In much of the Democratic Party, it's now fashionable to say that America is racist. That is a lie. America is not a racist country.
So at the same time, we have the National Guard now being deployed to Kenosha, Wisconsin, after protests broke out over the shooting of Jacob Blake, a 29-year-old black man. Caitlin, how did Republicans try to portray these issues of race during the first night?
Well, exactly what Nikki Haley was describing there. They have really tried to play up this idea of cancel culture. We heard that from the president's address at Mount Rushmore over the summer. We've heard them talk a lot about, focusing on the Democrats who are running these cities and kind of portraying a country in a state of chaos and riots, which does raise questions about, well, isn't Donald Trump in charge of the country? And so this is his America that is being portrayed, not anyone else's, because he is in charge. I think it's also important to kind of think of the context in which this messaging is coming. First, we've seen in our polling that voters are seeing race relations in this country as becoming worse and not better. Majorities say that white Americans have a better chance of getting ahead than black Americans do. A majority say that the country is on the wrong track. A majority say that police are more likely to use deadly force against a black person than a white person. So you've seen kind of the public move on this, and the president not moving with the public. And we've seen him not only be out of touch with what the public at large is saying, but even some in his own party when he kind of went further on the issue of changing military bases and the removal of Confederate flags. And so that's kind of part of the messaging here, that Republicans want to focus on what is going on in other parts of the country, and they're trying to make this play for suburban voters who we've seen in the 2018 midterms flock away from Republicans and towards Democrats. This kind of messaging to me seems more like a play to the base of the party and not necessarily to those voters that they want to turn back over.
Right. Well, Anita, looking ahead, tonight we're going to hear from more of the Trump family, Melania, Eric, and Tiffany Trump. But Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will also speak. And we've discussed a lot about President Trump breaking norms. Anita, how does tonight play into that?
Well, you're exactly right. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is speaking. He's speaking from overseas in Jerusalem. There's a lot of talk about how secretaries of state have not generally done this. First of all, they haven't done it overseas, but they just actually have really not participated in either political convention because of that idea that no matter who is elected, America needs to get along with its allies around the world, that it should have a united front. So he is breaking with that norm. I've also noted that Larry Kudlow, who's an advisor to the president, is also speaking. We generally don't see administration officials speaking at conventions like this. So they're breaking norms that way. They're also breaking a norm in that the First Lady is speaking from the Rose Garden at the White House. President Trump is also speaking from the White House on Thursday night. That is generally not done for the reason that there will be likely to be federal officials, employees that must help them with their speeches, and these employees are not supposed to engage in political activities while at the White House. So there's been some controversy about that. Both of them are still giving the speeches there. So, they have taken all this criticism, but they just have said, okay, they don't care about that, and they're just going to continue on with those plans. So I think You'll hear a lot about that tonight. You'll hear about that again on Thursday night as well.
All right. Paula Reid, Nikole Killion, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Anita Kumar. A lot to sort through there. It's only Tuesday. Can you believe it? Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.